The coffee grew cold in the porcelain mug as Helen watched the rain streak down the kitchen window. 20 years. 20 years since her daughter Mary had vanished during her grandmother Eleanor's funeral, leaving only muddy footprints leading towards the cemetery, then disappearing into nothingness. The bitter taste in her mouth wasn't just from the poorly brewed coffee. It was the taste of guilt she'd never fully swallowed. The phone rang with an insistence that made her hands tremble. Helen hesitated before answering, as she always did when the phone echoed through the empty house. She'd learned that bad news arrived in the morning when one wasn't yet prepared to endure another disappointment. "Helen, this is Detective Miller." The voice on the other end held a tension she recognized immediately. "I need you to come to the cemetery now." Her heart leaped. For 2 decades, she'd waited for this call, both dreading and longing for it at the same time. "You found? You're better off seeing it for yourself." The rain hammered against the windshield as Helen drove through the familiar streets of Oakhaven. Each bend in the road took her back to that October of 1996, when the golden leaves of autumn contrasted sharply with the grief that had enveloped her family. Mary had been only 8 years old when she disappeared, and Helen had never forgiven herself for leaving her daughter alone during the funeral, even if only for a few minutes. Helen couldn't process the words. Her vision blurred, and the world around her seemed to spin in slow motion. "What did you find?" The air seemed to have grown heavier, as if the cemetery itself were holding its breath. Helen closed her eyes and tried to remember that terrible day. Mary had played amongst the wreaths that morning, her laughter incongruously echoing in the somber atmosphere. She wore the navy blue dress Helen had bought especially for the funeral, with black shoes that made a soft sound on the wooden floor of the chapel. "She hasn't aged, Mrs. Harrison." Miller's voice seemed to come from far away. "Mary is exactly as you last saw her, like an 8-year-old child." The world stopped. Helen felt the blood drain from her face, and a mortal chill spread through her veins. "That's not possible. People don't stop aging. She should be 28 now." "I know. We don't understand it either. But that's not all." Miller knelt in front of her, forcing her to look into his eyes. "She was alive, Helen. When we opened the coffin, she was breathing." Helen's mind refused to accept the information. 20 years. 20 years buried alive in her grandmother's coffin, without aging. It was impossible, a nightmare her guilt had created to torture her even more. But the tears streaming down her face were too real, and the pain in her chest was too intense to be just a dream. "Where is she now?" Helen managed to whisper. "At the hospital. She's under observation, but—" Miller hesitated. "She doesn't speak, Helen. She doesn't respond to any stimuli. It's like she's in a catatonic state." Helen rose abruptly, staggering toward the car. She needed to see her daughter, to touch her hands, to confirm that this impossible miracle was real. But as she drove to the hospital, the questions hammered in her head like nails being driven into wood. How had Mary survived 20 years without food, without water, without air? How had she not aged a single day? St. Teresa's Hospital was silent when Helen arrived. Her footsteps echoed through the antiseptic corridors, and the smell of disinfectant burned her nostrils. The nurse who received her had kind eyes, but avoided direct eye contact, a sign Helen had learned to recognize as pity. "She's in room 237, the nurse said softly. "But, ma'am, I need to warn you. Your daughter is different. Not just physically. There's something in her eyes that—" Helen didn't wait for the end of the sentence. She ran down the corridors until she found the room's door, and when she opened it, her world was completely reconstituted. There was Mary, lying in the hospital bed, exactly as she remembered. Her brown hair still formed soft curls around her face. Her skin had the same rosy hue of childhood, and even the navy blue dress was intact, as if it had been washed and ironed yesterday. Mary! Helen approached the bed cautiously, as if her daughter were made of glass. My daughter, it's Mommy. Mary's eyes fluttered open, and Helen gasped, the air leaving her lungs. They were the same brown eyes she remembered, but something was wrong. Something ancient and deep that shouldn't exist in the gaze of an 8-year-old. It was as if decades of impossible knowledge were trapped within that familiar iris. "You came," Mary said, and her voice was the exact same crystalline voice Helen heard in her dreams. Helen took her daughter's hand, and the touch was real, warm, alive. "Mary, where have you been? What happened to you?" "I was waiting." Mary smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Grandma Eleanor told me many stories, stories about our family, about secrets no one should know." A shiver ran down Helen's spine. "What secrets, my daughter?" "About what you did to me, Mom. About why you needed me to disappear." The accusation cut Helen like a knife. "Mary, I didn't do anything. You disappeared during Grandma's funeral. I searched for you for 20 years. "Do you remember the prayer, Mom?" Mary sat up in bed, her movements oddly graceful for a child who had spent decades immobile. "Do you remember the prayer you said every night before I went to sleep?" Helen felt her throat close. She remembered, yes, a strange prayer her mother-in-law had taught her, filled with Latin words she never fully understood. Eleanor insisted it was a protective blessing, a family tradition that needed to be upheld. "Sit tibi terra levis, little soul. May the earth lie lightly upon you until the time of your return." Mary recited perfectly, her voice echoing in a way that made her hair stand on end. "You knew what you were doing, Mom? Did you know you were preparing me?" "Preparing for what?" Helen whispered, though a part of her already knew the answer. "To be the offering, to keep the family safe for another generation." Mary's words echoed in the room like a whispered confession in the dark. Helen recoiled, releasing her daughter's hand as if it had been burned. "This doesn't make sense. Your grandmother was a religious woman. She would never—" "Was she, Mom? Or was she something more?" Mary tilted her head with childlike curiosity, a gesture Helen remembered perfectly, which now seemed laden with ancestral malice. "Did you ever wonder why our ancestors lived so long? Why the women in the family were always special?" Helen thought of her mother-in-law, who had died at 97, with a sharp mind and a relatively strong body. She thought of Mary's great-grandmother, who had reached 100, and her great-great-grandmother, who, according to family legends, had lived to 105. Always the women, always long-lived, always with strange stories whispered at family gatherings. "Each generation needs to make its offering," Mary continued, her voice taking on a hypnotic tone. "An innocent child willingly given up by the mother to ensure that the lineage continues to be protected. Grandma Eleanor did it with the daughter no one ever knew. The great-grandmother did it with the son who died of pneumonia. And you, Mom, did it with me." "No!" Helen screamed, but her voice came out as a desperate moan. "I would never do that. I loved you more than anything." "Loved me so much that you left me alone at the funeral? Loved me so much that you didn't question when I disappeared? Loved me so much that you stopped looking after a few months?" Mary stood up from the bed, and Helen noticed her feet didn't quite touch the floor. "But it's okay, Mom. I understand. It's what you were taught to do." Helen held her head in her hands, trying to process the implications of Mary's words. If this was true, if her mother-in-law had really orchestrated her daughter's disappearance, then she was complicit in a horrible crime. But if she had really been manipulated, why had she never suspected? Why had she never questioned the family's strange traditions? Do you want to know what I learned during those 20 years? Mary approached, her eyes shining with a supernatural intensity. I learned that there are things far worse than death. I learned that love can be a chain as strong as hate. And I learned that some debts can never be repaid. The air in the room became heavy and suffocating. Helen felt as if invisible hands were squeezing her throat, and for a moment she had the impression that she wasn't in the hospital anymore, but back in that October of 1996 when everything began to fall apart. "Mary, please," Helen pleaded, reaching out to touch her daughter's face. "I didn't know. If I had known, I would have died before letting anything happen to you." "I know, Mom." Mary took Helen's hand, and her touch was cold as marble. "That's why I'm not going to hurt you. You were just a pawn in Grandma Eleanor's game. But someone needs to pay for what was done." "She's dead, Mary. Your grandmother died 20 years ago." "Oh, but she didn't die, Mom. She just moved." Mary smiled, and for the first time, Helen saw something genuinely childlike in her expression. "She's waiting for you at our house. She wants to talk." If you're still with me, you're probably feeling the same tension I felt writing this. Stories like this that tap into our deepest fears about family, guilt, and sacrifice are something I love to explore. If you too are drawn to narratives that challenge our perception of reality, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. I promise we'll always bring you stories that will make you question what you really know about the people you love. The house where Helen had raised Mary was exactly as she remembered it, except for a feeling that something fundamental had changed. The walls seemed to breathe with a life of their own, and the scent of faded flowers permeated every room. Mary walked the head, her bare feet making a soft sound on the wooden floor, as if it were a dance she had rehearsed for years. "She's in the dining room," Mary said without turning. She always enjoyed receiving visitors there. Helen hesitated at the doorway, her hand trembling on the doorknob. For 20 years, she had avoided that room, unable to bear the memories of family meals, conversations about ancestral traditions, and her mother-in-law's piercing gaze when the subject turned to Mary's spiritual education. When she opened the door, Helen saw a woman sitting at the head of the table, her back to her. Her gray hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, and she wore the same black dress Helen remembered from the funeral. But something was wrong with the proportions, as if the body had shrunk but retained the rigid posture of death. "Eleanor?" Helen whispered. The woman slowly turned, and Helen had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. It was her mother-in-law's face, but transformed by something she couldn't name. Her skin had a grayish pallor, her eyes were completely black, and when she smiled, Helen saw that her teeth were stained with earth. "Helen, dear, at last we can talk without interruptions." "You're dead," Helen said, her voice a choked whisper. "I saw you buried." "Death is such a limited word," Eleanor replied, gesturing for Helen to sit. "I prefer to think I've undergone a transformation, a necessary evolution to continue protecting our family. All protection comes at a price. A sacrifice per generation," Mary added, her voice echoing in a way that shouldn't be possible in an enclosed space. Helen felt nausea rising in her throat. "I never offered Mary. I never agreed to this." "Not consciously," Eleanor admitted, "but you prayed that prayer every night. You repeated the words I taught you. You performed the ritual, even without fully understanding the meaning." Memories flooded Helen's mind. She remembered the nights Eleanor insisted she stayed with Mary, the strange stories her mother-in-law told about guardian angels and ancestral protection, the times she had woken to find Mary talking to herself in the room, claiming she was speaking to a special grandmother. "You groomed my daughter," Helen said, anger beginning to overcome fear. "You manipulated her, manipulated me, so I would participate in this horror." "I ensured our family remained protected," Eleanor retorted, her voice taking on a defensive tone. "Do you think it was a coincidence that your husband died in a car accident shortly after Mary's birth? Do you think it was luck that you got that job that supported the two of you? All protection comes at a price, Helen." "And now?" Helen asked, looking at the daughter she had lost and found in a way she never imagined possible. "Now you must choose," Mary said, her childlike eyes bearing an ancient sadness. "You can accept what has been done and continue living with the family's protection. Or you can try to break the pact and face the consequences." "What consequences?" "All the misfortunes that have been avoided for centuries will fall upon you at once," Eleanor explained. "Sickness, poverty, violent death, madness, everything the pact kept away will return multiplied by 10. Helen looked at her hands, noticing for the first time the wrinkles that had formed over the years. 20 years of guilt, 20 years of pain, 20 years of a half-life. And now to discover that it had all been orchestrated by a family tradition she didn't even know existed. "And if I choose to break the pact?" she asked. "Then you will die," Mary replied simply. "But I will be free." The simplicity of the answer cut Helen like a blade. Her daughter, who had spent 2 decades trapped in a state between life and death, was offering her own freedom in exchange for Helen's life. It was an impossible choice, yet at the same time, the only choice that made sense. "There is a third option," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "You can take my place. You can become the guardian of the family, protecting future generations. Mary would be free, but you would become something different." "Different how?" "Like me. Neither alive nor dead, but existing between the two worlds, ensuring the pact is upheld." Eleanor stood, and Helen noticed that her feet made no sound on the floor. "It's a sacrifice, yes, but it's also a form of love." Helen closed her eyes and tried to imagine an eternity like her mother-in-law, trapped between life and death, manipulating her family to uphold ancestral traditions. But when she opened her eyes and saw Mary, still 8 years old, still in that navy blue dress she had chosen for the funeral, the decision became clear. "I accept," Helen said, her voice firm for the first time in 20 years. "I take your place." Eleanor smiled, and for the first time, Helen saw genuine approval in her eyes. "You were always stronger than you thought, Helen. Mary will be safe." "Mom, no!" Mary protested, but her voice carried more relief than genuine despair. "You don't have to do this for me." "I do," Helen replied, rising and walking to her daughter. "I should have protected you 20 years ago. Let me protect you now." Helen held Mary's face in her hands, memorizing every detail: the brown eyes, the small nose, the mouth that still held the innocence of childhood. "I love you, my daughter, and I will continue to love you, even if in a different way." "I love you too, Mom," Mary whispered, and for the first time in 20 years, she was just a frightened child again. "Will you be okay?" "I'll be where I can watch you grow," Helen answered, though she knew the definition of grow would be different from what she'd imagined. "And I'll make sure no one else in our family ever goes through what you went through." Eleanor approached and touched Helen's shoulder. "The ritual must be performed at the cemetery, at the family tomb. When the sun sets, you will take my place, and I can finally rest." As they walked to the cemetery, Helen felt a strange peace settle in her heart. For 20 years, she had carried the guilt of not protecting her daughter. Now, finally, she would have the chance to correct that mistake, even if the price was her own humanity. St. Jude's Cemetery was shrouded in mist when they reached the family mausoleum. Eleanor's tomb had been opened, and Helen could see the empty casket at the bottom of the grave. Mary stood beside the grave, her eyes fixed on her mother with an expression that mixed love and sadness. "Are you sure?" Mary asked one last time. "I am," Helen replied, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Now go. Go live the life that was taken from you." Helen descended into the casket, lying down in the velvet-lined interior. The metal was cold against her back, but she felt no fear. When she looked up, she saw Mary and Eleanor standing at the edge of the grave, two spectral figures against the golden sunset sky. "Thank you, Mom," Mary said, and Helen saw tears streaming down her daughter's face. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be free." "Thank you for giving me the chance to be a real mother," Helen replied. As the earth began to fall onto the casket, Helen closed her eyes and felt a transformation begin in her body. It wasn't pain exactly, but a sensation of becoming something different, something that existed between worlds. When she opened her eyes again, she was standing beside the grave, and she could see Mary walking toward the cemetery gate. Her daughter had grown. Not physically, but in some essential way. Her shoulders were straighter, her steps firmer. And when she turned to wave one last time, Helen saw that Mary's eyes finally held the age they should have. 28 years of experience condensed into a gaze that had learned to forgive. "She will be happy," Eleanor said, her form already beginning to fade. "And you will be a much better guardian than I was." "How can you be sure?" Helen asked, watching her own hand become translucent in the twilight light. "Because you chose love over duty," Eleanor replied. "Because you understood that protecting someone sometimes means sacrificing yourself for them. I never understood that." As Eleanor disappeared completely, Helen felt the weight of her new responsibility settle upon her shoulders. She was now the family guardian, the protection between worlds, the assurance that future generations wouldn't have to go through what Mary had endured. But she also knew it would be different. She would protect through love, not fear. She would guide through truth, not manipulation. And if ever another child in the family were in danger, she would find a way to protect them without demanding impossible sacrifices. Helen watched Mary disappear into the twilight mist, and for the first time in 20 years, she smiled. Her daughter was free. She was alive. She was ready to live the life that had been interrupted. And Helen, even in her new form, would continue to be her mother, her protection, her guarantee that love could overcome even the darkest traditions. The cemetery fell silent, except for the gentle sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Helen turned to the family mausoleum, knowing that it was now her responsibility to watch over, protect, and ensure that love always prevailed over fear. She had eternity to correct what other generations had gotten wrong. And for the first time in 2 decades, Helen felt complete.